The year is 1910. Across America, from the bustling streets of New York City to the dusty saloons of the Wild West, a common scene unfolds. Men gather after a hard day's work, seeking solace and camaraderie in the warmth of their local tavern. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation, the aroma of hops and barley, these are the sights and sounds of a nation indulging in its thirst for alcohol. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, a storm is brewing. A movement, fueled by moral conviction and a desire for social reform, is gaining momentum. This movement, spearheaded by women across the nation, seeks to eradicate the consumption of alcohol and usher in a new era of temperance. The pre-Prohibition era was a time of stark contrasts. Industrialization and urbanization were rapidly transforming the American landscape, bringing with them both progress and social ills. Alcohol, once a largely unregulated aspect of daily life, became increasingly demonized. Saloons, often seen as dens of iniquity and vice, were blamed for a litany of societal problems, including domestic violence, poverty, and crime. As the 19th century drew to a close, the temperance movement, initially a fringe group advocating for moderation, morphed into a powerful force demanding complete abstinence. This call for prohibition resonated deeply with women, who bore the brunt of alcohol's destructive effects on their families and communities. The temperance movement was not merely about restricting alcohol, it was about empowering women. In an era when women were denied basic rights, including the right to vote, the movement provided an outlet for their voices to be heard. Women like Frances Willard, the charismatic leader of the Woman's Christian Temperance Union, and Carrie Nation, the infamous saloon smasher, became household names. Their impassioned speeches and tireless activism galvanized support for prohibition, transforming it from a radical notion into a mainstream political movement. Women were drawn to the temperance movement for a multitude of reasons. They witnessed firsthand the devastating impact of alcohol abuse on their families. Husbands, driven to drunken rages, often subjected their wives to physical and emotional abuse. Wages, desperately needed for food and shelter, were squandered at the saloon, leaving families trapped in a cycle of poverty. Saloons, often off-limits to women, were perceived as breeding grounds for immoral behavior, further fueling their desire to see them shuttered. With limited avenues for political participation, women found their voice in the temperance movement, making it a driving force behind the push for prohibition. The debate over prohibition cleaved American society in two. On one side stood the Dries, a coalition of progressive reformers, religious groups, and women's organizations, united in their belief that alcohol was a menace to society. They argued that prohibition would reduce crime, strengthen families, and elevate American morality. On the other side stood the Wets, a diverse group comprising recent immigrants, working-class men, and those who viewed prohibition as an infringement on personal liberty. They argued that prohibition was unrealistic, unenforceable, and detrimental to the economy. The stage was set for a showdown that would have far-reaching consequences for the nation. The political landscape of the early 20th century was ripe for prohibition. World War I, with its emphasis on patriotism and sacrifice, provided a powerful impetus for the movement. Anti-German sentiment, fueled by the war, was directed at German-American brewers, further bolstering support for prohibition. The need to conserve grain for the war effort provided a convenient economic justification for banning beer and whiskey. In 1919, after years of relentless campaigning by the Dries, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. The noble experiment, as it was dubbed by its proponents, had begun. Section 4, the Roaring Twenties, Lawlessness and Speakeasies. The ink on the 18th Amendment was barely dry before its shortcomings became apparent. Far from ushering in an era of sobriety and virtue, prohibition ignited a period of unprecedented lawlessness. Across the nation, a thriving black market emerged to quench the public's thirst for alcohol. Speakeasies, clandestine establishments serving illicit liquor, sprang up in cities and towns alike, their hidden entrances and password-protected doors adding an air of intrigue to the illicit trade. The Roaring Twenties, as the decade became known, was a time of jazz, flappers, and a blatant disregard for the law. The unintended consequences of prohibition were both profound and far-reaching. Organized crime, sensing an opportunity for immense profit, seized control of the illegal liquor industry. Gangsters like Al Capone, ruthless and ambitious, amassed fortunes through bootlegging, smuggling, and racketeering. Their ill-gotten gains fueled a wave of violence and corruption that permeated every level of society. Law enforcement, outmatched and outgunned, struggled to enforce a law that a significant portion of the population simply refused to follow. The noble experiment was failing, and its failure was breeding chaos. Section 5. The price of Prohibition: crime, corruption, and consequences. Prohibition's failure extended far beyond the realm of law enforcement. The loss of tax revenue from the legal sale of alcohol created a gaping hole in government coffers. The closure of breweries, distilleries, and saloons resulted in massive job losses, exacerbating the economic hardship of the Great Depression. Moreover, the quality of illicit liquor was often dubious at best, and downright lethal at worst. Backroom stills, lacking proper sanitation and quality control, churned out dangerous concoctions that sickened and killed thousands. The human cost of Prohibition, measured in lives lost, families torn apart, and a society grappling with the unintended consequences of a failed social experiment, was staggering. As the decade wore on, public support for Prohibition dwindled. The images of gang violence, rampant corruption, and poisoned liquor were difficult to reconcile with the promised utopia of a sober and virtuous nation. The Dries, once a potent political force, found themselves on the defensive. The Wets, emboldened by the failures of Prohibition, stepped up their calls for repeal. By the early 1930s, it was clear that the noble experiment had run its course.